Hello and welcome to another coffee tasting video where we're tasting the subscription coffees that we're sending out to all our coffee subscribers around the world. And this is the February 2022 coffees that we're gonna taste. If you don't know what a coffee subscription is, it just means you're signing up to a subscription, and I choose coffees to send to you every first Wednesday of the month is when we send it out. If you're in, let's say, the US, it might take a week before you get it. If you're in Norway, it normally takes a few days to get it. So we send it out with DHL or normal postal service. And then you can pause it at any time. You can stop it at any time. You can subscribe for 1 to 6 bags. And as I said, I'm the one who chooses the coffees. Normally we send out 3 different coffees. So that means if you subscribe to 4 bags, you will get 1 of each coffee and then an extra bag of the first coffee. If you subscribe to 5 bags, 1 of each, extra bag of the first and extra bag of the second coffee, and so on. So that's kind of how it works. If you think that sounds exciting, make sure to visit our website. That's where the subscription choices are made. Cool. So for the February coffees, we're sending out 3 different coffees from 1 single farm, which I think is very, very exciting, because we can taste differences in the coffees that are grown in the same place, depending on the process and the variety. And today we're going to taste 2 different processes and 2 different varieties. Does that sound exciting? That's exciting to me, at least. The farm I'm talking about is Los Pirineos in El Salvador. It's located on a volcano. It actually is a volcano. When you go there, the farm starts at the bottom of the volcano and then goes all the way to the top of the volcano. And the farmhouse is on the top of the volcano, and you have a 360-degree view around it. So it's a beautiful, beautiful place, and a lot of coffee buyers like to take photos there because it's just amazing views, and they're doing amazing work at the farm. Now, it used to be my dear friend Gilberto Baraona who was running the farm, but unfortunately he passed away in 2020, I think. So his son took over, Diego, and together with his sister and his mom, they're running the farm now. But of course they have staff who has been working on the farm for many years. So actually last season for me was probably one of the best seasons we've had from this farm. The coffee qualities were incredible. And I know that this is the fruit of the labor of the work that Gilberto has done in the past, because he was working really, really long term in improving his farm, planting new varieties, improving the wet mill. He invested in a dry mill so he could sort and pack his coffee on the farm before it was exported. They were working with the different agronomists in order to improve the health of the farm. So all of this is work that is done over a long time, and of course it will affect the quality over time. And I think that's why, like last year, the coffees were tasting really, really good, and that's the coffee we're sending out now. Sounds exciting, huh? So let's get into the tasting. I've prepared this as a normal cupping. If you don't know how to do that, we have a tutorial on YouTube and on our webpage. It's basically 11 grams of coffee ground to like filter ground, the way you would brew maybe half a liter of coffee in a Hario V60, for instance. And then I pour 180 grams of soft water on top. If your coffee has a lot of bicarbonate or calcium, and you know if you do, because you can see it in your kettle, then you need to filter that out or to buy some bottled water that is very soft. That's when you can enjoy these coffees the most. So the first coffee we're sending out is a Bourbon variety. It's normally called Bourbon Elite from this farm, and that's because the Bourbon they have is very, very old, and it was used by the Pro Café organization who, in order to kind of research the different varieties in El Salvador and develop new Tequisic, which is also a Bourbon, but it's a kind of a more further developed or selection of Bourbon. So this is one of the kind of original Bourbons in El Salvador. That's why they call it Bourbon Elite, but it's just a Bourbon. If you look at the beans, they are a little bit longer maybe than some of the Bourbons you can see from other countries. And I think this coffee is exceptionally sweet, and that's kind of why we buy it, because it's so sweet and nice. Let's taste it. My first impression of this coffee is actually, normally this coffee doesn't have that much acidity, but now when I taste it, it does actually have some acidity. And this is because it's from the top of the farm, so it's from the highest altitudes, and those coffees are normally picked quite late, and they develop a little bit more flavor and acidity. The kind of predominant flavors in this coffee is maybe towards like brown flavors, as I call them. So I would originally or immediately think of like chocolate, a little bit of nuts, like roasted almonds, stuff like that. But it has an interesting acidity and a slight kind of fruity tone to it as well. And especially when it cools down, you can get these kind of hints of dried fruit or something like that. Now, this is quite difficult to assess if you're only tasting that coffee, so that's why I have a very, very big contrast on the table. I have a Kenyan coffee, just so to make it easier for me to describe these coffees. And I recommend doing that at home as well. If you have like any coffee in general, it could be Kenyan or Ethiopian, or it can be even a very, very low quality coffee or instant coffee. Put it on the table and taste it next to these coffees, and then it will have, you know, a much easier way of describing the flavors. So this Kenyan coffee is quite classic. It's from Karagoto and it's very fruity. And this has very high acidity. So when I go back to the washed Bourbon from Los Pirineos now. Yeah, it has acidity, but it's much less present than in the Kenyan coffee, of course. And it was so much easier to pick out those kind of roasted nuts and chocolatey flavors. I find this coffee to be very clean, very smooth, quite syrupy. By syrupy, I mean like when you have syrup in your mouth, it's kind of dense and heavy and thick, but it's also very sweet. And the aftertaste, it really reminds me of like when I eat chocolate, you have this kind of bittersweet lingering finish. This is what it reminds me of. So the first coffee is washed. And when I say washed, they don't really wash like they do in Kenya at Los Pirineos. And that's because they don't actually have water there. So they have a huge basin where they collect rainwater, and they use a mechanical mucilage remover that removes most of the mucilage by using very, very little water. So instead of using, say, 50 to 100 liters of water per kilo of coffee in the traditional washing method like they do in Africa, with this method they might use 1 liter per kilo or even less. So it's to conserve water, and that means maybe there's like 10% of mucilage left on the coffee when it's drying. So it's not completely washed, but it's washed enough so that it's tasting really clean. And as it cools down, it just gets better and better. Now the second coffee is actually the same variety, Bourbon, but it's a honey process. And it's kind of processed in the same machine, but they kind of lower the pressure on the water on the machine. And that means more of the mucilage was left on the beans while it was drying. And if you don't know what mucilage is, think of when you're eating a peach or something. You have kind of the fruit flesh, and then there's still some slimy stuff left on the stone in the middle. That's kind of what mucilage is. So it's kind of you can remove the skin and the kind of pulp from the coffee cherry, but still there's some slimy layer on the beans that we call mucilage that is left on. And this is normally fermented and then washed away before it's dried. But then honey process is where you leave that mucilage on, whether it's 90% of the mucilage or 10% of the mucilage. It's really up to the farmer. Here it's maybe 50% or a little bit more, because it's what they call a red honey process. And it's also dried under shade, so the color of the beans when it's drying becomes more red. They have like a technique of the way to do it. And normally it will leave you with a little bit more fruit flavor. And if you compare it to the first coffee, which is the same variety but it's washed, then it definitely has more fruit flavor to it. This fruit flavor, it's not very dominant like you would have in a natural coffee, but it's very similar to the fruit flavor you get in natural coffees. So we know that with honey process and naturals, it's more of a maybe a yeast-driven fermentation of the mucilage, whereas in the washed coffees, it's more of a bacterial. Of course, the washed coffee here is not really fermented, so you can't really compare that, but you get these kind of fruity flavors from breaking down on the mucilage. Wow, so this is predominantly, when I taste it isolated, has a bit of this kind of stone fruit flavors like peach, stuff like that. But it's quite mild, but it's there for sure. A little bit more acidity than the first coffee, and maybe a little bit more fruit driven. You don't kind of get the roasted nuts and chocolatey flavor as dominant. It's more like a fruit dominant coffee. But let's compare it to the Kenyan. Oh, the Kenyan is very fruity. When I get back to the honey processed bourbon, still quite fruity, but a little bit kind of thicker in the mouth. It feels rounder in a way, and not as acidic as the Kenyan, but more kind of rich mouthfeel, almost like you have this kind of yogurt feel to it, like the acidity you get in yogurt. So that's the honey process, and compared to the first one, very different drinking experience. So if you're subscribing to 2 or more bags, I highly recommend tasting them side by side. You can make it as French press or filter, it doesn't really matter. Just taste them side by side and see what you think. And why not let us know what you think in the comments below? There's no right or wrong here. So it's fun to kind of see the difference with the same variety, what process can actually do with the coffee. Now the third coffee is quite exciting because it's actually the first time I ever have this coffee and taste this coffee myself. It's also a honey process, so the same process as the second coffee, but it's a different variety of coffee. It's a variety called Casiopea, or yeah, I think that's how you pronounce it, Casiopea. And it's a hybrid made by crossing Caturra, which is a dwarf mutation of Bourbon, and then an Ethiopian landrace. So what the researchers have done in Catia in Costa Rica, they've taken one tree and cross-pollinated it with the other. So this is a natural kind of cross-pollination controlled by a human being. And it's Caturra, which is very common to grow in Colombia. And then Ethiopian landrace named ET41, not ET phone home, ET41. So they mix this together and then they plant the seeds of that, and that becomes the first generation, which normally is very unstable. So if you plant a lot of these seeds, you will see some high trees, some short trees, some trees have a lot of cherries, some trees have, it's a lot of variation. And that means if you take seeds from the first generation again and plant, you will get a lot of variation. So it's not a stable variety, it's what they call a F1 hybrid. And that means the farmers cannot really plant seeds from these trees. They have to get seeds from a certified place. You can say what you want about that, but this is kind of the new research in varieties that some people are skeptical to and other people praise because it's supposed to be the future of disease-resistant varieties. Who knows? Time will show. Anyway, Casiopea, it's supposed to have very, very excellent cup quality according to the World Coffee Research. You can go to, maybe we'll put a link below, the World Coffee Research variety catalog. You can read more about the variety there. But when you hear the words Caturra and Ethiopian landrace crossed together, you definitely get some positive associations because those are very nice varieties. Definitely get some more fruit-dominant flavors. Maybe a slight florality, but not like you get in Ethiopia, where it's more like towards jasmine and coffee flowers, orange blossoms. But there is some kind of a floral thing here, and maybe some fruity things. It feels a lot more kind of juicy, like you're drinking some kind of concentrated juice. Maybe more like a pasteurized juice, like that kind of acidity. It could be like a rose hip thing or rhubarb, or yeah, quite pleasant. Maybe an apple juice as well. And it's much less nutty. Like the first one is more like nutty and chocolatey. This is even more fruity. Let's compare it to the other two. Quite high acidity, quite sweet, quite intense acidity, but it has some nice fruit to back it up, so I don't really mind that. The Bourbon for sure has lower acidity. The Casiopea is, you know, acidity much higher, more intense fruit flavors, very, very smooth. And the aftertaste is quite refreshing. It's not as lingering as the first one, which is more like when you eat chocolate, you kind of have chocolate flavor in your mouth for a long time. Wow, very different going from the third to the first for sure. Let's compare the Casiopea to the Kenyan. Kenyan still, you know, fruit level, it's a different league. It's always more intense, I think, the best Kenyan coffees. Very intense acidity, very intense on fruit flavor. But the Casiopea has maybe a little bit more roundness to it. It's not as intense in the acidity as the Kenyan, but for sure more intense than the other El Salvadoran coffees. Cool, so all these coffees were produced by Los Pirineos and Diego and his family. And I think it's very, very interesting quality. We didn't have a lot of this Casiopea, so that's why it's for our 3-bag and 6-bag subscribers only, because that's basically it, what we're sending out. But it's the first time we actually buy it, and I thought it was very interesting when I cupped it last year, for when I purchased it. And it did have this kind of appley flavor that the other ones didn't have at all. So I hope you really enjoy these coffees as much as I did. I for sure am going to drink all of them in the next coming weeks, because when we're recording this, it's still 2 weeks until we do the shipping. So we still have some roast testing to do on these batches before we send them out. We want to make sure that our coffees taste at their best before we ship them out to all of you. So rest assured, I hope you will enjoy these coffees, and yeah, hope to see you next time. Thanks for watching, and if you want to subscribe, remember to go to our website and sign up for a subscription. See you next month, hopefully with a guest. That would be awesome, I think. Ciao, ciao.